Okay. Parshas Baloscha, Pasuk Dalit. Zemasa Menorah. This is how the menorah was made. Miksha Zov, Adyerecha Picho, Mikshahi. It was one block of gold that was hammered out from the base to the flowers. Kamara Shehera Hashem es Moshe Kenosas Menorah. As the form that Moshe was shown on Sinai, that's how the menorah was made. So Rashi explains, Emasa menorah, Shereya Kodesh Baruch Hu be'etzba. Hashem had to show it be'etzba. Lefisha niskashe bo, lekach nemazeh. Zeh means he had to literally point, like we said, Zeh kelu v'anveyu, that the Shivcha Layam, the Jews were able to point with the finger. When they saw the Shechina, the divine presence at Kriyas Yam Suf, it says Bezer. It could have just said Masam Menorah Mikshehi. What's Zer? This is to lose the Moshe difficulty making the menorah. So he instructed him exactly how the menorah should be made. That's the Zer. Heralo HaKadosh Baruch Be'etzba. That's the pointing finger. Miksha. So Miksha, Rashi says, he says earlier, like by the Kaporis with the Kruvim, it was hammered out from one piece of gold. Kenosis a menorah on the bottom. The menorah itself, we said earlier that Moshe Rabbeinu had difficulty making the menorah. So Hashem says to Moshe, take the block of gold, put it in the fire, and it came out, a menorah. So we asked the question last week, we spoke about it, because the menorah says te'oseh, it should be made. Doesn't say taseh, because Moshe had difficulty making the menorah. So Hashem says, just put the block of gold into the fire, and the menorah came out by itself. So from there, we showed this concept of Yogata Motzoso, that you have to take some degree of initiative. What's the initiative? Because if it was a miracle, Hashem could have had the menorah just come straight out of the fire without Moshe putting the block of gold in the fire. The answer is, when it comes to Torah, since the menorah represents Torah Shemal Peh, you have to have that degree of initiative. So whatever you could do, you do. Whatever is beyond your capacity, that Hashem gives to you. That's the endowment. That's the understanding. Therefore, it's te'oseh. It shall be made. So Moshe Rabbeinu therefore put the block in, was told to put the block of gold in the fire, and the menorah came out by itself. That's Chazal. And we explained what was the difficulty of Moshe. What wasn't he able to form? It wasn't the physical form of the menorah. As we said, that every vessel in the menorah, every component of the Mishkan had to be infused with a certain kavanah, with a certain intent, that it should function within the capacity of existence. As a result of that, just as Torah is infinite, because it's Chochmas Hashem, therefore only Hashem was able to infuse it with that intent. Therefore, it was Teoseh. That's the understanding. I mean, as I'm speaking, I thought about something. We said, why did Moshe have difficulty with the menorah, not with anything else? Because the menorah represents Torah Shemal Peh. Torah Shemal Peh is what? Is unlimited. It cannot be quantified, because it's Chochmas Hashem. As a result of that, that's the reason why the only one was able to infuse it with that intent was only Hashem himself. So what does Moshe do? But whatever he could do, he did. He took the block of gold, put it in the fire, and since that was beyond his capacity, the menorah came out. That's how we explained it. But as I'm thinking differently. That not because the Torah it can't be quantified, it's unlimited. It's the infinite. And as great as Moshe was, he has no relevance to the infinite. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu has relevance to the infinite. Because Hashem is infinite. But I was thinking differently. We had said that the Mishkan was a microcosm of existence. The terrestrial and the celestial. And the Medrash had shown that corresponds creation with the Mishkan. We had said that the water in the Kior, in the laver, corresponds to Yikov HaMayim. The Urios in the Mishkan, which were the curtains, as it says in Tilim, Note Shamayim Ki Uriah. God spread the heavens like that tapestry, like that curtain. So we see this corresponding factor. The Torah itself was the basis for creation. It's not the creation itself. You understand? The Mishkan is a microcosm of creation. That's what it is. The menorah is not, it's not creation itself. That is the basis for creation. Every other aspect of the Mishkan corresponds to creation. Terrestrial, celestial. The Torah was the energy through which creation came about. The terrestrial, celestial. That's the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't able, didn't have the capacity, because that preceded creation. And the only thing that preceded creation was what? Was Hashem. It was the Torah itself, even though it says the Torah existed 900 and so many generations before creation, but that was a manifestation of the Chochmas Hashem. So I'm just saying, because that was the very beginning, that was the ultimate in the next ex nihilo. As a result of that, that's the reason why it was beyond Moshe Rabbeinu's capacity. That's what I was thinking. So I was thinking, and I once said this, we find by the Egel, we've mentioned that the Medrash tells us that idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. And the laws pertaining to a ger are mentioned 48 times in the Torah. It's 48 versus 48. And this is mentioned Parshas Yisro. When Moshe Rabbeinu had a question, should he go out to greet Yisro? When Yisro came with Zipporah and Moshe's children, he sent a message to Moshe, I'm coming, and if you want to come out for me, fine. If not, come out for the sake of your wife. And that's not for the sake of your wife, come out for the sake of your children. Right? That was Moshe Rabbeinu's, that was what Yisro sent the message to Moshe. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, you go out for the sake of Yisro. Why? Because since he was an idolater, and he had abandoned idolatry for the sake of becoming part of Klal Yisrael, to accept the Torah, therefore he's worthy that you should come out to acknowledge him for who he is. He left idolatry, which is mentioned 48 times in the Torah, to become a convert, an authentic convert, to become a Jew. Therefore, you go out to acknowledge his value. That's what Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu. It says 48 idolatry, 48 gerus. That is the accomplishment. It's something which is an unbelievable accomplishment, to be able to extricate yourself from idolatry, to become the ger, to become a Jew. So I said then, we read in Pirkei Avos, there's Memches Dvarim She'atorah Niknas Behem, the 48 ways which you acquire Torah. What is the ultimate antithesis to Torah? Idolatry. The antidote to be able to take control, that idolatry should not have any effect on you, it's the Torah itself. That is the ultimate end. The most extreme level of influence Yetzer Hara is what? The evil inclination is idolatry. So what is Yetzer Hara? Yetzer Hara represents is 48. Idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. As a result of that, Gerus is an extrication from that to become a part of Klal Yisrael, which is Kabbalas Torah. You accept, you're committed to the Torah. As a result of that, it's 48. It's 48 versus 48. As a result of that, to be able to achieve and arrive at a level that you're have the ultimate antidote to be able to deflect the influences idolatry and to subordinate it, you have 48 ways through which you acquire the Torah. That's the idea why it's 48. Because we find Gerus is mentioned 48 times. That's what I said then. How did the Egel come about? Aaron gathered the gold because the whole idea was it was supposed to be a delay tactic because he believed that by the time he finishes gathering the gold and they want to make the Egel, Moshe will be back. So Rashi cites the Chazal. There were a number of sorcerers from the Erev Rav and the rabble had come out with Klal Yisrael. And when they put the gold in the kiln for the Egel, they used witchcraft, sorcery, and all of a sudden, instantaneously, the Egel came out of the fire. They didn't even have to form it. It just came out by itself. And they used sorcery to be able to bring that about. So the whole concept, the delay issue, it didn't work. If it would have been under natural means, the Egel would have been formed. Moshe Rabbeinu would have been back. But because they used sorcery, it came out immediately out of the fire. But it's peculiar. The menorah, which represents Torah Sheba'al Peh, all the energies to bring about the Siyata Shemai for Torah Sheba'al Peh, how did it come about? Moshe took the gold, put it in the fire, it came out of the fire. And how did the Egel, which ultimately took us down, at Kabbalah Torah, we reverted back to pre-sin of Adam Rishon. What brought us back to post-sin? The Egel, idolatry. How did the Torah come about? The Kabbalah Torah, by taking the gold, putting it in the fire. It came out. Identically at the same level, how did idolatry come about? Which toppled it, which was the counterforce. They put the gold in the fire, and through sorcery, the Egel came out, which ultimately brought us post-sin of Adam. Brought us back to post-sin, and therefore was subject to death and subject to whatever else we were subject to. And how does that impinge on us? We said, the Chazal tell us that when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, the letters which were fire, they floated upward. What did that represent? That represents Shikras Torah, the forgetting of Torah. If the Luchos would have never been broken, the Torah would have never been forgotten. Anything you study would have been emblazoned in your neshama, on your mind, would have never forgotten it. But because the luchos are broken, therefore there's such a thing as shikras that we forget, and therefore we have to continuously study and study and study to review. Otherwise, if not for the breaking of the luchos, we would never forget. Now, why? We find that Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchos. It says Asher Shibarto. Aluchos Asher Shibarto. So the Gemara tells us, I mentioned, the Gemara Shabbos, Yashkochach Shibarto. HaKadosh Baruch gave a Yashkoach to Moshe and he broke the luchos. Why? Because if he wouldn't have broken the luchos, Klaus would have to be destroyed. Why? So the Medrash says, because God forbid, Chas v'sholom, a woman gets married and she commits adultery under the chuppah. An adulteress has to be put to death. What did the breaking luchos, what were they the equivalent of? It was the annulment of that marriage. Because the relation was annulled, therefore there's liability, but doesn't have that extreme level of liability. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Yashkocha Shibarto. But factually speaking, what was the consequence of the breaking of the luchos? Besides our survival. Now we survived. We were compromised. We reverted back to post-sin. What's post-sin? The Gemara tells us that if not for shikha, forgetting is a gift to humanity. Because if a person would lose a loved one, the pain and the depth of grief at that moment, if it would be at that same moment continuously for the rest of your life, you couldn't survive that pain. So Hashem gifted humanity with forgetting that takes the edge off of that. Even if you remember the event vividly, but factually, it blurs. There's a certain blurring degree, and therefore the person is able to survive it. So the chet of Adam Rishon brought about what? Death. The day you eat of that fruit, you'll be subject to death. Once there's death, you have to have shikha. So once we're post-sin, as a result of that, we're subject to forgetting. So if the luchos, breaking of the luchos, brought us back to post-sin, and we're subject to death, now what are we? We're beings that have to forget. Once you have to forget, you forget Torah also. If we pre-sin, when we revert back to pre-sin, the Gemara says, if not for the Chet Egel, the Jews would have been eternal. We wouldn't have been subject to death. If we're not subject to death, forgetting has no relevance to Klal Yisrael. If it has no relevance to Klal Yisrael, one doesn't forget the Torah. But now that the break of the Luchos brought us to post-sin, and we are subject to death, as a result of that, we have to have the gift of forgetting that endowment. Once you forget the Torah also. Therefore, goes hand in hand. The breaking of the Luchos is synonymous with forgetting, because that brought us back to post-sin, because otherwise we would have been destroyed. Because the breaking is the equivalent of the annulment.
Rabbi,
At the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash period, when they destroyed the Yetzirah of Avodah Zorah, right? What happens is they fasted 100 fasts, and a fiery lion came out of the Kodesh Kodoshim, out of the Holy of Holies. And they tackled it, they put it in a lead cylinder, and they disposed of it. And because of that, it minimized and it took away the drive for idolatry, because the drive for idolatry was more consuming than sexual drive in a human being. Now, a fiery lion comes out. Where does it come out of? The Holy of Holies. That means that's the location of the Shekhinah. Say it comes out from somewhere else. The answer is they're on par. Meaning from the same location, which you have the antidote to counter it, at that same point, you have the Yetzirah of Avodah Zorah. Therefore, the lion, which represented that force, came out of the Holy of Holies for that reason. And that's the 48 verses to 48, as I mentioned. 48 times idolatry is mentioned, 48 times gerus, conversion is mentioned, because the ger extricated himself from that state to become part of Klal Yisrael, which is only through the Torah. This, we find that we're going to have it soon, the Paraduma, right? The Paraduma is referred to Zos Chukas HaTorah. That's the ultimate statute. Shlomo Melech understood every statute, but the statute of Paraduma, he did not understand. He said, Rechoka mimeni. It's even beyond my grasp. Every other statute, through his unlimited wisdom, he was able to come upon its truth, its understanding. Paraduma is beyond. So we ask the question, why? Why is Paraduma this? It's something, although it's a chok, it's a statute, but in terms of its innateness, it's something which is beyond human grasp, even the wisdom of Shlomo. So we mentioned, the Rechaim HaKodesh says over there, that what does the Paraduma refer to? Zos Chukas HaTorah. This is the statute of the Torah. So, and what is that? The Paraduma, that a person comes in contact, contracts the contamination of the dead. The only way you could relieve yourself is only through the process of Paraduma. And how it works, it's Matame Satorim, it contaminates those who are pure, and it purifies those who are contaminated, so on and so forth. So we ask, it should say, Zos Chukas HaTorah. This is the statute of purification. Why does it say Zos Chukas HaTorah? Or it say Zos Chukas HaTumah? This is the statute which relates to impurity, spiritual impurity. Why is it Zos Chukas HaTorah? That's the question Or Chaim asked, HaKodesh asked. So the answer is, we did a Korban Pesach in Egypt. In Egypt, there's no mention that we had to purify ourselves before we did the Korban Pesach. Like you said, here we talk about the people who are contaminated with the dead, and they weren't qualified to bring the Korban Pesach because they were contaminated. What about in Egypt? So the Rechaim HaKodesh says, pre-Sinai, a Jew, what was our classification? We were B'nai Noach. Classified as Noahites. A non-Jew does not contract contamination. Even if he comes in contact with the dead, he's not Tomei. Only a Jew becomes Tomei. Why? What's the reason? He says because, and this is where he explains it, a Jew himself, the dimension of Kedusha that he has is something which is overwhelming. The neshama of a Jew is a different realm of reality than the neshama of a non-Jew, the soul of a Jew. An animal that comes in contact with the remains of a human being, it's not contaminated. Why? But a Jew, yes, he said, well, it's not a human being. So what about a Gentile? What about a Noahide? So Chaim HaKadosh explains, what is the basis for this level of contamination? And it could only be relieved with the paraduma. We have in existence, we have nether forces. These nether forces are a representation of the counterforce to Kedusha. When you have an overwhelming level of these nether forces, the result is contamination. That generates this level of contamination. That's what it is. Before Sinai, the Nishmas Yisrael didn't exist. Only as a result of Nasa v'Nishma did we become Odom. Did our neshamas expand to a whole different dimension of existence. As a result of that, pre-Sinai, our neshamas didn't generate that kedusha. Therefore, the nether forces that exist, they have to be sustained with kedusha, with holiness. They attach themselves only to something which is the ultimate level of holiness. An animal that has no holiness whatsoever doesn't attach itself. The non-Jew, because of the level of intensity of kedusha of his soul, the nether forces don't attach itself to the non-Jew. The Jew has this mega soul that these nether forces in an overwhelming level attach themselves. As a result of that, the Jew becomes tummy. Therefore, it says, Zos chukas haTorah. This only happened at Sinai. As a result of accepting the Torah at Sinai, the Torah impacted our neshama, that it took on this unlimited level of kedusha, and as a result of that, now we're subject to contract this level of contamination, because now with this magnetic force, which attracts all these nether forces. This is the Arachai HaKodesh. Okay? So what was the activator, which activated our neshamas to become Odom? Nasav Nishma, the Kabbalah Torah. So the Torah itself caused that metamorphosis within us. What is Torah? And how do you relieve it? Paraduma. So the paraduma was created as a mechanism which addresses the unlimited dimension of the kedusha of the neshama, that when the nether forces attach themselves, they are released from the neshama. But what's that due to? That's due to Kabbalah Torah. Torah itself is what? Is the infinite wisdom of Hashem. The only one who understands that is only God himself. Therefore, just as the menorah itself, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have the capacity to infuse it with that intent, because it's unlimited, and all he can do is put the gold in the fire. Identically, Shlomo, regardless of his degree of wisdom, but it's not unlimited. And it's up to a point. Therefore, the only one who is able to understand the inner workings of Paraduma, because it's directly connected to the makeup of the Jewish neshama, which only became that due to the Torah itself. The metamorphosis came about because of the Torah itself. The Torah itself, only God understands the extent of that. As a result of that, even Shlomo, he understood every statute, but Paraduma, he did not understand. Because the basis for that is understanding the dimension of Torah to its ultimate limits, which only God understands. Therefore, Shlomo says, Rechok mimeni, for that reason.